For some, the creation and empowerment of a directly elected European Parliament has been an unmitigated disaster. For Maioni, for example, a directly elected Parliament exemplifies, it's the main example of the category mistake, as he puts it, by which it has been mistakenly believed that the European Union even belongs to that category of polity that can possibly be democratic. I argue completely the other way round, and perhaps oddly, that a directly elected European Parliament can contribute to delivering standards of indirect legitimacy, by which the Union can be legitimate with national demoi. I will give just a summary of my argument on the assumption that the full details are there in the paper and can always be checked out. I first argue that the EU is best understood as indirectly legitimate, where it helps its member states meet their own obligations to their own publics. Here, I assume that governments at least owe their publics basic procedural standards of public control with political equality and individual rights to justification. However, more unusually, I also argue that governments have obligations to their own publics to deliver policy outcomes that secure values of justice, democracy again, and freedom from arbitrary domination. And that task, in turn, obliges them to manage externalities between states. However, all of that poses a predicament which I explore in full in the paper. Here's the predicament. If any one member state has an interest in externalizing harms to others or in free riding on the external benefits supplied by other member states, then its own voters and its own national parliaments will also have an interest in doing those wicked things. So, here's the predicament, here's the problem. The output condition for indirect legitimacy, namely cooperation between states to manage externalities between them, which inhibit core values inside states, that output condition would seem to conflict with the most obvious input condition for indirect legitimacy, namely control by national parliaments and control by national electorates. To the extent that the European Parliament can help manage this predicament, I argue that it should be considered a contribution to the indirect legitimacy of the Union and not just its possible direct legitimacy. Of course, there are some people who would object that all of this is absurd. It's absurd to consider the European Parliament a national legitimating mechanism. The very idea upsets everyone. Perhaps on the grounds that the European Parliament is not connected to national publics through a competition for their votes that allows them a meaningful choice over union policies or leaders, the famous second order argument. However, Janie Mansbridge in the political theory literature uses what she calls a selection model of representation to show that competition and sanction are not the only ways of doing representation. There are other ways of securing representation. As she puts it, representatives can be selected in ways that make it likely that they will already be internally motivated to represent voters in certain ways. They don't need competition and sanction to get them to do those things. Members of the European Parliament are indeed selected in ways that are useful to representation of citizens at the European level. They're selected on the basis of the known policy positions of national political parties. Whilst that is an imperfect form of representation, and I myself have criticised it in other contributions, it would be absurd to say that that has no value at all. It uploads to the European level a left-right form of representation that is both common to most member states and relevant to the exercise of the Parliament's powers. Moreover, precisely because the Parliament is elected in member states and in contests in which national parties structure voter choice, the composition of each 5-year European Parliament is very much one of national party delegations. Behind the European party groups lies a second party system of 200 national party delegations. The groups depend on the national party delegations for their own cohesion, and they attempt to decide voting instructions by a consensus of the national party delegations. So how then can a directly elected European Parliament help manage what I have called the indirect legitimacy predicament? First, it can simply help identify where the management of externalities between states can help secure core political values within states. Second, it can help edge the union just a bit closer to an ideal where there is no one body, such as, for example, a cartel of governments in the Council of Ministers, where no one body can control union legislation, yet that legislation can be controlled by a multiplicity of bodies. Third, a directly elected European Parliament breaks open the cartel of governments by allowing national parties of opposition both votes and voice in union legislation. That allows for greater political equality in how well different opinions within national democracies are represented in the exercise of the union's legislative powers. Finally, a directly elected European Parliament can help overcome the asymmetries of information national parliaments face in their own scrutiny of union decisions. I was interested to see Rick's article on this. So to conclude, the paper contests the argument that no demos means no directly elected European Parliament. In contrast, I argue that a directly elected European Parliament can contribute to identifying externalities between member states. It can, on top of that, help combine the regulation of those externalities with member states' own standards within their own domestic arenas of public control, political equality, and justification. A directly elected European Parliament can therefore help reconcile acute difficulties in delivering the output and input conditions for indirect legitimacy simultaneously. As I try to argue more fully in the paper, it's not incompatible with a Europe of national democracies. It is required by a Europe of national democracies. Thank you very much.